Thank you. So let me begin with a story. I went to visit a small company in Texas a few years ago, and this company was run by a single gentleman for 40 years. He made all the decisions, and he suddenly passed away just at the time when his company had lost about half its workforce due to a decline in sales and rising costs. I met with his widow, who wanted to keep the company alive. She did not know what to do. She ended up being connected with the technology extension specialist nearby her company. That specialist transferred information to her, helped her develop a training program to retrain her employees, and helped her get a new product on the line and out the door. As a result, she became almost immediately profitable. Sales grew dramatically, and she hired back most of the people that ended up having to be fired. And she said that this was a milestone in the history of her company to be able to work with this extension service and change the way her company did business. So I want to use that as a way to explain what technology extension is. Okay, so I'm having, there. So I'm going to talk about what it is, how it works, why it's important, give you some ideas of what kinds of outcomes you can expect, and then some insights, things we know, things we don't know. So I hope after this I've convinced you that this is an interesting policy for you to pursue, and welcome your thoughts during the break after this. So I mostly do write reports and articles, and one of the recent ones I've written is about international models for technology extension for the Inter-American Development Bank, which I urge you to download. But I am in a group that does transfer of both frontier technology, we have an incubator and so on, and we do technology extension. So that is what I'll be talking from, actual practice of operating this program. So what is it? It's basically what we call real services. It's not something that you just load up on the internet or you're giving a tax break, even though many of us like tax breaks. It's really about providing advice through a decentralized network of specialists. They share their know-how with companies, usually at the company location. So why is this important? I will talk about how we think this is kind of an overlooked policy. Many policies focus on R&D and kind of the glamorous high-tech stuff, when most of our businesses are in this kind of middle range, doing regular producing of goods. We think, and I think you heard from our last speaker, that large companies pretty much across the world are all very productive and growing even more productive, but middle and small companies are not adopting just regular off-the-shelf mature technologies, and that's where the big gains in productivity will occur. Also, we see an increasing amount of global competition, which has led to reduction of trade barriers. So many of the protections that our small and medium-sized companies have gone by the wayside, and they're going to need to adopt these mature technologies. So the future is faster, more open. Where are the new ideas? They're everywhere in the world. More customized, but better quality. and integrated along supply chains. Technology extension can help with these areas and these trends. So probably in most countries, more than 90% of the firms are small and medium-sized firms. So most people work at small and medium-sized firms. Yet they don't really always get the kind of attention they deserve. And that's what this program is all about. Why are small companies having trouble with adopting off-the-shelf technologies? There's the traditional market failure argument, but it does have meaning when you look at the small company. Many small companies have their head down, they're just trying to get business out the door. Or they're all about, they want to just make enough money to have a nice lifestyle. So they're either unable because they're too busy to learn about mature technologies, or they're unwilling to learn about mature technologies. So there are some demand side gaps. There are also supply side gaps. In the US, there are thousands of programs for small and medium-sized firms, and I think the same in Latin American countries, but it's very difficult for these programs, both private sector consulting firms and public sector programs, to connect with the small firms. It's very costly. It's much easier to work with a big company. You know where they are and the company's ready to use your services. Also, there are strategic concerns. Many countries have paid less attention to manufacturing, more attention to services, and are now thinking maybe we should be paying as much attention to manufacturing. So there's kind of a rebalancing that's been going on. There's an increase in interest in exporting along with globalization. We have ever more supply chains and concern about enhancing local and regional economic development. So what kinds of services are delivered under technology extension? The core service is information provision. The technology extension specialist has know-how and shares this know-how with the small and medium-sized company. There's also benchmarking, comparing one company with another. And as these extension services go around the region, they're learning more about what seems to work with some companies and not with others. Typically, technical assistance will be involved. So a company may have a technical problem, like the paint won't stick. And the technology specialist will come in and help with this problem, and then once they get in, they'll say, oh, I see you have this problem and this problem. Usually, an extension service specialist will come in and do an initial assessment. Sometimes it'll be a formal assessment with a document. Someone asked me, do you have a pre-packaged assessment tool? Yes, there are many pre-packaged assessment tools, and you're welcome to them. But sometimes the firm is very small, and if you come in with a big questionnaire, that's a big turnoff. So actually, the first time I went around with a technology specialist, he walked through the plant, did a plant tour, didn't say a word, and at the end picked up like 40 things that the manufacturing firm could be doing to improve its productivity. There's often training, and while most technology extension services are done at a one-on-one basis, there are many group assistance services. Of course, you have to make sure that in the group you don't have competitors. Also, there can be collaborative R&D projects, and typically there's coaching and mentoring where the technology specialist will work with the company, say, a few hours a week over a year. So they're kind of like the coach of a football, soccer team, but for a manufacturing company. So someone asked me, where should this be located? Say, okay, we are convinced we want a technology extension service, but who's going to run it? There's a lot of politics involved. What's the best place? Well, the answer is this is a very pragmatic and flexible program. So there is no best place. It really depends on the history of your country. In the case of the UK, they have a manufacturing advisory service that is run by the commerce function because that function has run prior advisory services and business assistance services. In the case of Canada's IRAP program, Industrial Research Assistance Program, that is run by the research function. And that program had kind of a 100-year history of running R&D, collaborative R&D programs for small and medium-sized firms, and so they added an advisory service. In the case of the US, we did not want the commerce function running this program because political parties periodically want to get rid of the commerce function in the US because we have kind of an ambiguous relationship between how much we should intervene in industrial relationships. So we put the Manufacturing Extension Partnership in the standards function. So it's got a little bit of a technology orientation, but also a transfer orientation under standards. And in the case of Fraunhofer's and some similar programs, those are private nonprofit organizations. So it really depends on what works for you. Also, I'm always asked, how do you pay for this? So there is a cost, and let me describe many efforts to try to make this program pay for itself. Actually, many tech transfer programs, the idea behind them is let the program pay for itself. So the issue is when technology extension is asked to pay for itself, it becomes a consulting firm. So the first thing it does is go after the large companies who have the money to pay for services. And essentially that means it competes with a private sector firm. That's not what you want the government to do, set up something that competes with private sector firms. Second thing it'll do is it'll look for companies wherever they are, and they could be mostly outside your country. And in fact, one of the examples I will show is a program that has now moved much of its customer base outside its country. So it's helping programs in other countries, but not in its own country. So what good is that to your country? So with that, we say it's very important for a technology extension program to have some core funding so the mission, the public service mission, is retained in the country. But at the same time, the government may not be the best source for paying for everything. For example, we find in the US that unless you have the companies put a little bit of money in, they don't have skin in the game and they won't do anything. And the way technology extension works is the extension specialist puts some amount of time and the company puts in orders of magnitude amount of time, and that's how they learn and make improvements. So if they're not prepared to do that by putting up a little bit of money, that's not going to work. Also, many of these programs are regional. So sometimes it's useful to have the regional government, in your case the department, put in some money. In some places that doesn't always work, in some places it does. But in the US, for example, we've got a 1/3, 2/3 match funding approach. So the national government will put in 1/3 and the extension centers will get the other money from either private sector firms, local foundations, or state governments. In the case of Canada, it works best there for them to pay for everything. And they even give money to their clients. If we did that in the US, I don't know that the program would be as trustworthy. They're very trustworthy in Canada. You can give out money and people will follow the rules. So in the case of the Fraunhofer Institutes, they say they don't get much government funding because they're a private nonprofit, but they do, in fact, get the majority of their funds from local governments and state governments, but on contract projects. So I think what we're saying is this is a pragmatic program, fund it through what works. So I'm going to talk about 3 models of technology extension. The first is what we call the dedicated field service approach. That's what we have in the UK and the US. Basically what the problem is there is small and medium-sized firms lack awareness and they need tacit knowledge to adopt mature technologies. The second type of program is the technology-oriented business service. There you've got weak technology linkages for startup firms and small and medium-sized firms, and that's the program in Canada that I'll talk about, the Industrial Research Assistance Program. And then the third is the Applied Technology Center Service. The problem there is there's an underinvestment in R&D in small and medium-sized firms, and those are the programs we see in Japan, in Germany with the Fraunhofers, and Tecnalia in Spain is kind of a program that mimics the Fraunhofer Institutes. So this goes back to my argument about why technology extension is overlooked. So it seems that many, certainly developed countries, but even middle-income countries, put a lot of investment in these advanced technology services for startups, the glamorous side of technology transfers. So you see advanced R&D programs, incubators, technology licensing programs. Those are here. Then you've got the regular startups that aren't involved with technology, and you'll see a lot of business services for those. And then you see firms that are about to go out of business, and you see bailout programs for those over here. But what about all these regular small and medium-sized firms in the middle that are relatively stable? They make up most of the economy. Why aren't there services for them? And they're involved with some technology, some mature technology, so they have a technology need. So that's where we position technology extension. So you might ask, how do we know who is the target customer? You've talked a lot about manufacturing, but maybe we don't care solely about manufacturing. We might want to put in some food companies. We might want to put in some software companies. Where is the boundary? Well, typically these programs do work well for manufacturing because manufacturing is a traded industry. It's an export industry, and it's a technologically oriented industry. But many programs, including for the IRAP program in Canada, have this manufacturing plus orientation. So just because your firm is not in the manufacturing industry classification, it's still included in the Canadian program. So they will include a lot of agricultural programs because some goods, food type goods are delivered. They will include some software because software is kind of a delivered product, if you will. So then the second question is, what do you mean by technology? Typically we mean off-the-shelf, mature, known technologies and techniques. So we would include, say, a piece of equipment to help reduce energy use, and we would also include lean manufacturing production processes. But these types of services are often best and most useful if they are integrated with basic business services, strategic services, training services. So there's kind of a little bit of a gray area between what is technology and how it is best integrated in with other services. And then the last thing I'm usually asked is, how do we target? Actually, I've read some interesting research lately about how targeting maybe isn't as great as we thought it was, because how do you know that the target is right? And, but leaving that aside, let's just assume we want to target. What do we target? First of all, do we target regions? In general, these programs do work best if they're delivered at the regional level because you're closest to the customer there. They don't work very well if you sit in your center all day long. You know, if the center is, say, in Washington, D.C. or Bogota, or they do work well if you're kind of located in a network where the companies are. Should you target a sector? We answer that it depends on the makeup of your economy. In the U.S., we have kind of a broad-based economy. We do have pockets of clusters, for example, the automotive cluster in Detroit. But we don't think it's a good idea to have hard and fast clusters because it adds more red tape. This firm is in the cluster, this firm is not in the cluster. And also, we think there's diversified enough services that everyone broadly in the manufacturing area can find benefit from those services. But in Spain, for example, the FEDED program is organized around clusters of companies in particular regions and memberships. So in that case, it is good to have a cluster approach because they're already organized around these industry clusters. And lastly, should you target a particular technology? That's what the Fraunhofer Institute does. So the issue is, as we learned from our last speaker, technology it changes rapidly. So you have to be prepared to open centers and close centers. I mean, the Fraunhofer Institutes are very flexible on closing centers. And I can tell you it is difficult for many government-involved programs to end the programs. So you have to be very careful with that. Now let's talk about what kinds of benefits you can expect. First of all, how would you even measure benefits for this kind of program? We typically use a logic model. Usually the company has a problem. The company is connected to the center through an extension specialist. Services are delivered in conjunction with the manager of the company. There are some intermediate impacts. Those are critically important. I'll talk about what those are. Then there are some business impacts, and then there are some developmental impacts on jobs and wages and so on. So how do we measure this? Usually there's three ways. The first way, and maybe the most common way, is we count who was served and how many projects there were. So we do activity reports and annual reports. You see that across almost every type of service, technology extension service. The second way is you can conduct a survey with a company. You find out what kinds of impacts the program had on the company. By the way, you can also ask them were they satisfied, but if they just got reduced cost service, they should be satisfied. And then lastly are these big program reviews where you have a third party review the whole program and make sure it's operating effectively and make sure there are impacts. What are intermediate outputs? They're usually changes to the capacity of the company to have better business performance. In the case of the manufacturing advisory service, you see more productive use of equipment. Usually there's always a skills benefit. Just-in-time manufacturing practices, so less inventory, faster throughput, better space utilization because a lot of the services have to do with plant layout and laying out the equipment so the production process is more efficient, and increase in capital investment. Then in the case of IRAP, you've got increase in firm business skills, increase in knowing how to do R&D, technical knowledge and capabilities. So all these raise the capacity of the firm to have better performance. Then business outcomes. So typically you will see a focus on productivity, value added per employee. And there's a very famous study done in the US by a Census Bureau economist, Ron Jarman, who compared extension-assisted firms with those in the national census and found that extension-assisted firms were 3 to 16% more productive in terms of labor productivity than the unassisted firms. And he even controlled for selection bias if you're an economist and you're thinking, well, don't the best firms already go and talk to the manufacturing extension program? So he even controlled for that, and even trying to get rid of that relationship, he still found this kind of productivity benefit. There's also a benefit in terms of staying in business. We recently replicated his study and found that manufacturing extension firms were 18% more likely to stay in business. So the outcomes are generally pretty good. And then broader economic outputs. How do you measure this? Well, there's typically two ways. One is cost-benefit analysis. Here you see the Manufacturing Advisory Service say that for every pound of public funding, you get about 1.5 pounds of benefits. Now, of course, you can jigger with the cost-benefit analysis, play with it a little bit, and try to get 100-to-1 kinds of outcomes, but those are less believable, and the key is to make sure you include all the costs and all the benefits. In Canada, they ran an input-output model, which is the second way you see this is done. So looking at all the intermediate buying and the effect of the wages of the employees, and you see they found a 10-to-1 ratio when they did this kind of analysis. But what do we learn from all these evaluations? Many of these have to do with, say, accountability, program justification, but there's also should be a program improvement component. So one thing we've learned is that the manufacturing extension programs put in small amount of resources, and you get big benefits from that because companies put in even more resources. So one thing that's not measured too much is this idea of companies being in supply chains. It's kind of easy to survey one company, difficult to survey the whole supply chain. Another thing is, I mentioned this gateway function of manufacturing extension. Many companies find that the greatest benefit is they didn't know about all these programs, and the manufacturing extension specialist helps them find the right program, helps them fill out all the forms to get into that program or find the right private sector firm, helps manage the relationship, so if there's any bottlenecks, keeps that going, but that is less easily measured. So there's always a balancing act with these kinds of programs. You want to have high impact, but high impact usually comes from working intensively with a few firms, but you also want to have good market penetration. You want to serve as many firms as possible, but then they're not going to have as high of impact, so you've got this service kind of conflict. Also, you want to have financial stability. The program does no good if it's not going to be around, but you want to work with a few companies, and typically small and medium-sized companies get the most out of this service. So you've got a resource conflict, and then market penetration versus financial stability is another issue. So it's all about balancing these objectives. So finally, I will end by talking about some key characteristics. You want to offer field services staffed with highly capable people. I'm always asked, where do you find these highly capable people? We don't have these highly capable people. Well, even where I am, we don't have a long manufacturing tradition. So we thought, well, we don't have these capable people in my state. But you do have many large companies that retire executives. Those executives are not as challenged by playing golf every day. They want to give back to the community. And that is what the IRAP program has done, really used a lot of these executives to become their field specialists. You want to offer a breadth of services, these kind of platform services, not the services that just go to the paper industry. And you want to be pragmatic. You want to focus on mature services that are new to the firm and not frontier services. So technology extension. I will say about this, when it first was established in the US, it was put up to transfer laboratory technology to small and medium-sized manufacturers. So that went on for a few years, and a big study was done and found that small and medium-sized manufacturers cannot use lab technologies. They're not ready for lab technologies. They really need these pragmatic, mature technologies. So the program completely reoriented toward those. And then you see some of the other issues. It's not just a government program, not a short-term job program, although it can lead to job increases. And it's not going to bail out a dying firm. There are some benefits that can be gained, but it's not a bailout. And then lastly, key characteristics are field staff, especially with these dedicated field services programs oriented to manufacturing and having a decentralized network. Technology-oriented business services use more top executives. They offer a range of services, including money, and they use a decentralized network. Versus applied technology centers, they do more testing and center-type activities, but many of them have added on a technology extension function to go out and work with the companies. So, the main takeaway points, adoption of mature technologies is important for productivity in small and medium-sized manufacturing. Technology extension is associated with a set of pragmatic platform services, and it's about the sharing of tacit knowledge. You can't do this just by putting something on the internet. It really has to be, as I said, technology extension is a contact sport. You really have to have contact with the company. And this is our closing slide. We propose that an effective set of upgrading, innovation, support, and networking mechanisms for small and medium-sized firms is one of the foundation measures that nations and regions seeking to improve their economic standing need to have in place. So with that, I thank you.